It's patch notes day for Legends of Runeterra. Riot has released the patch notes. There's a number of balance changes in here. Some of them are pretty interesting because they're complete kind of redesigns of either cards or themes. And there's also some stuff that I honestly expected to be on the list and is missing. So we're going to do what we always do with these. We're going to go through the notes, kind of talk about them, and maybe do a little bit of predicting or extrapolating on what the meta might look like when everything settles down. So right out of the gate, I'm sure this probably is not very surprising. Hecarim is getting adjusted, and the changes are interesting because they are kind of taking away his upfront power but trying to keep intact his big power spike. In other words, they want you to build around Hecarim and not just throw Hecarim into absolutely everything. And as such, they have lowered his survivability. His health has been reduced by 1 point, and that's at both levels. But they also are kind of toning down his level up requirement. It used to be 8 ephemeral units that you've attacked with. That's now down to 7 because they do want you to build around him and then trigger him. But the toning down doesn't just stop there. So on top of him getting 1 less health, if we scroll down here, the Spectral Riders are now 2/2s. So this means that Hecarim will now be a 6-cost card that only threatens 8 damage instead of 10. But again, for the build around side and to make sure you get that big splash, his effect is now going to give +3/+0 instead of +2/+0 when you are attacking. So in other words, the ephemeral allies get a bigger boost. Now, the onslaught of shadows that is also tied to Hecarim is being adjusted as well. So it's not just Hecarim's version, but all versions are now going to have these Spectral Riders that are 2/2s, and as a result, they are also adjusting the cost. So the cost of this card is going to go down to 2 as well. So you're going to pay 2 to create 2 2/2s. That's a lot of 2s, but you get the point there. So I think that this is fine. I think that this will at least open up some diversity in the 6 slot. I think there's a lot of really other powerful 6-cost cards that if you're playing mid-range will potentially shine now. Traditionally, Hecarim kind of outclassed many of the other options that you were considering, and a lot of that depended on deck building. Shadow Isles has been just kind of notoriously strong for a bit anyway, so when you're looking at any deck that's running Shadow Isles, and then you're looking at for, you know, a beater, Hecarim was an obvious choice. But I do think that changes like this will be a great way to maybe have cards like Darius start to shine a little bit more again. Cards like Cytherea, who I think is already a bit criminally underplayed. I think that we could see a lot of Cytherea going forward. She is got a lot of stats, has a great ability, is very aggressive, kind of grants pseudo evasion. There are, just some 6-cost bodies, beaters, finishers for those kind of mid-range decks that I think have been waiting in the wings for Hecarim to be dethroned, or at least brought in line a bit to open up diversity. Overall, I do like this change, and I think it kind of fits the theme of champions. I think most champions, they want to be built around cards. They want the emphasis to be on the champion being special, and what makes a champion special is leveling up from a design standpoint. And so you want to build decks that are focused on leveling them up. And they say in the notes here that in most cases, Hecarim just wasn't even leveling up. It was just raw power. So I think that this change at least pushes that in the right direction, right? Time will tell, but that's the Hecarim change. Now, the other big overhaul, and this is likely not a big surprise because Callista has been in a pretty bad place for a long time. Callista is getting a rework. So Callista is getting 1 extra health at both levels, and I think that's a very, very big deal. It's one of the main reasons I think she was not played before. I recently in a video, or maybe it was in a video, maybe it was on stream. It might have been on stream, but I was recently ranting about essentially why Callista was in a bad spot, and it was largely because she felt like a worse version of Zed almost all the time, and there was just not really a real reason to play her. If you needed an early game body, Elise was your go-to in Shadow Isles, and then Hecarim was so good on the top end that you didn't need anything else, and Callista just was really clunky and awkward in every sense of the the words. So, that being said, she's getting 1 extra health, but they're also changing the way that she functions. So before, when you would play her, she would bond with an ally. Now that no longer happens. Now she's just a 4/3 fearsome, and she levels up when she has seen 4 or more allies die. So this is going to be very easy to trigger with ephemeral triggers, but even just, you know, spiders, I think is going to be very, very good. Tokens, I think prankster style decks could also be very beneficial with Callista. But essentially, she is a 4/3, and then she levels up when she's seen 4 allies die. But once she's leveled up, she becomes this 5/4 fearsome, and specifically she says, the first time I attack each round, revive an attacking ephemeral copy of the strongest dead allied follower. This round we're bonded, and it takes damage for me. Now, I find this to be very neat because there's a lot of cool deck building things that you can do. For example, Rekindler, and that card got adjusted. We'll kind of take a look at that later. We'll view that change later. But Rekindler with Callista, for example, here means that if you deck build in a way that Rekindler is the strongest top end follower in your deck, and once you've played one, a leveled up Callista will always bring back a Rekindler, which would then also bring back a champion. So you can still do those kind of cool resurrect chains that Callista used to be known for. But what really jumps out to me is actually the smaller version of that, and the version that I think is going to be most likely to come to fruition. I think that Wraithcaller is going to grow in popularity once again. It's kind of fallen by the wayside, but the idea of maybe dropping Hecarim from the old Wraithcaller decks and maybe going with a more low to the ground spider oriented one with a lot of bodies, where you're either triggering Elise early or potentially triggering Callista early, but then also running the Wraithcaller package, because Allegiance triggers on summon. So if Callista brings back a Wraithcaller and Allegiance triggers, you're going to get a Mist Wraith, right? And you can do that every time she's attacking. It is a great way to generate a lot of pressure, I think. The fact, again, that she is fearsome in a deck that was already featuring a lot of fearsome, I think is going to be very relevant. I know that deck kind of lost some power when Wraithcaller lost fearsome, but I think that if you're now jamming in something like Callista, who's another source of fearsome early on, it might actually offset some of that original nerf. Overall, I'm just really excited to try her out, because this is the closest to being truly playable that she's been in a long time. As I said, I think prankster-oriented decks are a great spot. I think that maybe ephemeral lists are a great spot, and I also want to try it in the Mist Wraith package. So Callista is interesting. There's a lot to like there. Black Spear is getting adjusted, and that means that Callista's version is as well. And this is just getting a cost bump. It's going from 2 to 3. So I'm okay with this overall. I think that it brings it a little bit more in line with like Get Excited, for example. Get Excited is you pay 3 to deal 3, but you have to discard a card. But the benefit there is it can also target the Nexus. Black Spear can't, right? And the discarded card is definitely a drawback, but it's in a faction where you kind of take those discards that are meant to be drawbacks and you turn them either into a positive, or you mitigate them with things like Chump Wump, right? In this case, it's kind of the same scenario, right? You are paying 3 to deal 3. You can't target the Nexus, but overall, outside of that, it's the same baseline effect tied to a drawback, but in a faction where you're intended to take that drawback and turn it into a positive. So I think that this is fair. All right. Followers and spells that got changed. Border Lookout has now become Vanguard Lookout, and it gained the Elite tag, which is okay, I guess. You know, they mention that their design goal is that every card has a home, but that they don't think it's going to be a massive change to their playability, and I think that they're 100% correct. This card isn't going to magically see play just because it's an Elite, at least for the time being. True, like, all-in tribal Elite decks kind of don't exist because the payoff for doing that isn't very high right now. if in future sets we get more elite support, it might be worth it. But essentially right now for elites, there's only like 2 or 3 cards that truly benefit from you playing elites. And then it just so happens that a number of other elites are decent cards on their own. And a card like this that is not just a decent card on its own and requires you to play one of the very small number of what I'll call elite enablers, it's just not very impressive. You know, even if you drop your, armor smith, I forget the exact name of the card, but the 2/2 that buffs your elites. If you drop that and then you play this, then great, you paid 2 for a 2/5, which is normally a stat line reserved for like a vanilla 3-drop, right? There are multiple ways that you can make a vanilla 3-drop a 2/5. But that's it. I mean, there's no keywords, there's no other interactions. It's just not very good. I think that this card might benefit from expeditions a little bit more, where you're more likely to maybe run into the elite synergy, but overall it's a minor change. All right, Mage Seeker, Inciter, Mage Seeker, Investigator. Essentially the Mage Seeker kind of theme, I guess is what we'll call it, is getting redone to focus on spells that cost 6 or more, and I think it's really interesting. So right out of the gate, Mage Seeker Inciter gets a big change. It's basically a brand new card. It's now a 4-cost 4/3, but it gets +2/+2 once you've cast a 6-cost spell this game. So, you know, a 4/3 for 4 isn't the end of the world, but getting yourself a 4-cost 6/5, maybe a little bit later on, could be really powerful. I think this is going to kind of play into the idea of, some sort of control deck where you use spells or things like that to fight for the early game. You pop off, one good 6-cost spell, and then suddenly you're getting all this additional value for the rest of the game. And I think that Lux is going to get a pretty big benefit from this, and I also think that it's going to raise a point that I had mentioned in a previous patch notes video, which was when they nerfed back-to-back, there was a small chance that that actually ended up being a hidden buff to back-to-back, because going from 5 to 6 was a pretty big deal, specifically with Lux. Well, now we're going to get a number of cards that care about 6-cost spells, and back-to-back is still very playable at 6. It's a powerful effect. It's at burst speed. So I think we're going to end up seeing a lot more back-to-back once again, because it has found kind of a new home. So anyway, Mage Seeker Inciter here, basically just raw stats. It's probably the most boring of the new kind of reworks, but you see where they're going with this effect. Investigator. This card used to be the Silence card, and I was kind of a big fan of it in Expeditions, because where in Expeditions you couldn't pretty reliably draft Purge, the silence effect. This gave you a great way to do it, and most people kind of didn't play around it, specifically on a body like this, so it was pretty easy to pull off. But the new version is apparently a 3-cost 3/3, but you create a Detain once you've cast a 6-cost spell this game. So it generates you card advantage for a stat appropriate body, right? A 3/3 for 3, and you get a free card if you've triggered an effect. It's very similar to the 3/3 for 3, where you draw a card if one of your allies has died. Kind of the same concept, but spell-based. Persuader. This one also got a very big overhaul, and this is the one that I think I'm most excited about as far as the Mage Seeker kind of rework. So this card used to be a 6-cost, like, late game monstrosity of a challenger card that just saw no play because it was not in a great spot. But now this is a 2-cost 3/2, but it gets +1/+1 in challenger once you've cast a 6-cost spell this game. Now the reason I like this card is because a 3/2 for 2, if it's just a vanilla 3/2, it's certainly not anything to write home about. Traditionally, most 3/2s are going to come with like a keyword at a 2-cost or some sort of additional effect, like granting an ally barrier, etc., etc. So a vanilla 3/2 is a bit below power level, but it's still good enough to kind of see play. because you can block fearsome units with it. It trades up with many 3-cost units because of the 3 attack. And I think that the floor of this card might make it entirely worth the potential ceiling of this card, because a 2-cost 4/3 with Challenger is a very efficient card for value trades, for removal that trades up. You know, you pay 2 for the body, and then if with that 4 attack you trade into something that costs, you know, twice its value, you're gaining a lot of mana advantage in that kind of exchange. So this card is intriguing. The fact that it gains Challenger is also really interesting, because if you want to play this in a more controlling style deck, getting additional Challenger units will be very beneficial at helping you keep the board under control and at a low cost. This is a great payoff. Even in non-control based decks, again, if you're in some sort of like mid-range deck that just also runs, you know, maybe 3 copies of back-to-back, then this card could again totally be worth the payoff. So I'm probably going to experiment with this one a bit. I think that it's the most enticing of the 3. I think it has, again, the smallest amount of drawback, if that makes sense, right? A 3/2 vanilla for 2 is fine. Crowd favorite, which I'm actually was surprised was on this list. I didn't realize this was even on the radar. Does get a bit of a nerf. It is now a base 2/1 as opposed to being a base 2/2. Iceborne Legacy. So this used to be a burst spell, and you granted an ally and then all copies of an ally everywhere +1/+1. They've changed it from burst to slow, and they've upped the cost from 3 to 5, but it grants an ally and all allied copies of it everywhere +2/+2. I don't know if that's going to be enough. We'll see. I think there are some interesting things that you could maybe do with that, but whether or not it's going to be good enough to be competitive, like right now, my knee-jerk reaction is no, because if you're spending 5 and it's a slow spell, you better be getting a pretty good benefit from it, which means this should probably be hitting at least 3 things already on the board, right? Like you want something like this to get you +6/+6 before it starts to really be worth your time and be relevant. Speaking of that, pack mentality got a bit of an overhaul. This is basically now just overrun from Magic the Gathering. So it used to grant an ally and then all other allies of its group +3/+3 in Overwhelm. It now is just all allies get +2/+2 in Overwhelm. So this is a great finisher for certain lists. It's kind of fantastic in like a go wide list. It's just a bit of a shame because it's in Freljord, which isn't really known for going wide. The only time they went wide was with Elnux, and Elnux already benefited from the old pack mentality anyway. So whether or not this finds a home, I don't know. I think it'll be much more prevalent in Expeditions. I think it will shine like all get up in Expeditions. But as far as Constructed goes, the power level has certainly went up, up, up. But whether or not it finds a home, we will see. Poros Next just gets a straight cost reduction. It used to cost 4, now it costs 3. And they mentioned specifically the Expedition archetype, as in it's the worst performing Expedition archetype by a large margin. I don't doubt that, because I don't think I've ever played it myself, because I look at them and I go, eh. Alright, Troop of Elnux. This is a card that I have been very critical of for many reasons, and it has been adjusted. However, the adjustment was simply that instead of looking at the top 10 cards of your deck, it now looks at the top 6. And, you know, they explain why they wanted to keep the random result the way they did, because they really wanted you to get a benefit from counterfeit copies decks, is what they call it. And I understand that, but I don't like it. It's still a random effect, just because it happens far less frequently. You know, they mentioned the hypergeometric calculator and did some play testing for a better rate. Okay, fine. But I don't care what the rate is. I don't care if it's 2% or 0.2% or 0.0002%. The fact of the matter is, no card on 5 mana on turn 5, maybe even less, should be accidentally deciding games. I stand by my gut check test, right? Which is, if in the final game of a world championship event, things get decided because somebody accidentally rolls like 5 Elnuks, it's not going to feel good for either player, and it's not going to be good for the audience, and it's going to make people think your game is a bit of a joke. So I get that they want the counterfeit copies decks to be a thing, and maybe this is a band-aid while they rethink how they want to tackle that. I hope that's the case. But I'm not a fan of this. Now, Elnuks could entirely just disappear with this change, right? If people do enough testing, they decide, hey, it's just not worth the value, unless you're, again, going with counterfeit copies, and the card basically disappears from the meta, I'm still going to be as equally critical. If you followed me in the Elder Scrolls Legends, you know that I would very frequently say that the card I felt was the biggest issue from a design standpoint was Unite the Houses, because I felt like it was very anti the spirit of what that game wanted to do, and I feel like Troop of Elnuks is my Unite the Houses of this game. There's so many other examples of good variants and counterplay, and things like that that exist in Legends of Runeterra. So the ability for something like this to exist in any way, shape, or form, again, even if it's accidentally, right? I don't care if it's 1 in, 2,000 games that somebody pulls like 5 Elnuks. That's still 1 in 2,000 games where one person got hosed from a silly and avoidable mechanic, right? The experience is the issue for me. It is not the rate of occurrence. You could say that Mana Screw happens far less often in Magic to me, and I would say, does it still happen? And if the answer is yes, then I'm still going to be angry, right? Because nobody likes to play a game where they didn't feel like they actually got to play the game. And that's kind of what Troop of Elnuks does when it goes off. The ceiling is the issue, and they're making it, far harder to hit that ceiling, but it's still there. So, and it still has the chance to be there in expeditions, right? When you can break the rule of 3 in deck building and you can jam them all in with expeditions. Again, is it going to happen often? No, because somebody's got to draft enough of them in expeditions and then have an early game to survive to that point. But again, if it happens at all, that's the problem that I have with it. So there's my rant. It's changed. I don't have, if I'm being honest, in terms of actual power level, I don't have any opinion right now. This is something that's going to require testing, right? It's entirely possible that it's dead. It's entirely possible that it's still fine. I think as long as it's averaging pulling like 1 extra unit, there's a lot of decks that might still consider playing it just because they need that mid-game presence to survive to get to their late game. Or again, maybe they've just kind of nerfed it to the point where it's only going to be played in counterfeit copies style decks. Whatever the case may be, the card is what it is, and we'll have to see more games, for me anyway. That's my assessment. Conspirator. This went from a 3-2 to a 2-2, and I'm not surprised by this at all. This is another one of those cards that, in theory, you get away with the big stat line because it comes with a drawback, but it's in a faction that is meant to take that drawback and turn it into a positive. This is the exact same vein as the Black Spear nerf and so on and so forth. So it's now a 2-2. It'll still see play. It still does what you want it to do. Chumpwump. This is not one that I would have had on my own personal watch list, but I'm also not surprised by this because the 4/4 body that also creates 2 cards, and those 2 cards are very flexible. They can be cheap spellcasts for triggers. You can pitch them to Rummage. There's just a number of things you can do with Mushroom Cloud. This card was very efficient. And by making it go down to 3 health, it can now get hit by Get Excited. It can get hit by Black Spear. It can get traded into by some 2-drops, right? So going back to that Mage Seeker that I'm eager to test when I was saying that, sometimes a vanilla 3-2 is good enough. this is one of those cases now where it can potentially just block and trade with a chump wump while you're trying to get yourself to the late game, and then you got all the upside of that card. So that's it. Just goes from 4 health to 3 health. I think that all the decks that ran this probably still run this because you just wanted a body, and this just makes them a little less efficient. Flash of Brilliance. This one is potentially a pretty big hit to Heimer decks. This card has been changed from a create a random spell to create a random spell that costs 6 or more in your hand. You still refill your spell mana, and they specifically mention how they kind of want this to be a crossover card potentially with certain archetypes, and they mention Lux, but the reality is this is kind of meant to nerf the turn 5 Heimer Dream is what I like to call it, right? You bank your 3 spell mana, you drop Heimer, and then even if they try to remove Heimer immediately, you can just pop off a bunch of burst spells. And if you've got, 3 Flash of Brilliance, then you've made 3 elusives at a minimum. And then if any of those made more burst spells, then you could keep going. But now you know that they're not going to contribute to what you can play immediately in that scenario. So they still generate you advantage. And in many ways, they kind of give you a better idea of when to use them for what I call the Hail Mary, right? Sometimes when you're in a bit of a pinch, in the past you might pop off Flash of Brilliance even if you're trying to save it for your Heimer combo later, because you were thinking like, okay, well, if I get this, random Mystic shot, it might save me. But you were stuck planning for an outcome that could have been literally any spell in the game. Now, when you're doing that kind of like mental tabulation, you can narrow it down to, hey, is there anything that costs 6 or more, right? If Judgment bails you out or something like that, then sure, maybe you take a swing. But if you really wanted like Vile Feast, you know you can't get that now. So overall, I think it's a nerf, but it will also kind of alter the play patterns, I think, of this card. Rummage. Interesting change. So Rummage couldn't be cast when you only had 2 cards in hand, and they said it wasn't a huge problem except with a level 2 Jinx. So in other words, what they're trying to tone down is a scenario where you've emptied your hand to level up Jinx, and then on your next turn, because you've emptied your hand to trigger Jinx, Jinx is supposed to draw you 2 cards to, one, like get you back in the game, offset the fact that you discarded your hand, but also the idea of like drawing 2 cards is an extra hurdle to getting her Death Rocket. But if you drew Rummage, then unless your other card discarded a card, so unless your other card was something like Get Excited, like Rummage was just dead. There's nothing you could do. So to offset that, because they, I think, want you to be running Rummage in Jinx decks, they've made it so that if you have exactly 1 other card in hand, then you discard 1 to draw 1. So it's play it and discard 2 to draw 2, unless you only have 1 card, in which case you just discard that card and draw 1. I like it. Unstable Voltician. This one is basically a buff, but it's really just a change to bring it more in line with the Mage Seeker cards. So this card, it used to say, when I'm summoned, grant me +4/+0 in quick attack if you've cast a 6-cost spell this game, and now it's grant me the +4/+0 in quick attack once you've cast a 6-cost spell. So it's just having its text modified to match the other cards. It's not in Demacia, and it's not a Mage Seeker card, but we see this a lot in Runeterra, where archetypes will kind of cross over between some of the other factions so that you can kind of mix and match, right? They're just kind of creating puzzle pieces in different areas where you can fit them together and make the jigsaw that best fits you. Brood Awakening is just straight up getting a buff, which I find to be really interesting. I think that they were looking at this card and I think they kind of realized that it was very disappointing at 6 for a number of reasons. One, it's very rare you get the full 3 Spiderlings. 2, when it costs more and it's slow, then Withering Wail, which will just destroy everything this makes, it's going to feel pretty bad. Many times, like even in Expeditions, I didn't want this card. It just was clunky. So they've given it a buff. They've dropped the cost to 5. Whether or not that's enough for it to still see play, I don't know, because now it's going to be competing with, the other spider that just comes down and buffs spiders on its own. We shall see. I guess my biggest issue here is that spiders usually don't have that big of an issue creating a wide board, and if they've created a wide board and it's been wiped, and then you're going to be relying on something like this to repopulate your wide board, you've probably already lost anyway. So I don't know. If this is enough, it would shock me. All right, Mark of the Isles. I am not at all surprised to see this here. It's one of the best cards in Shadow Isles, and it has been for a very long time. And it is now only granting +2/+2. So it's still good, and it will likely still see play even with that stat line. But I really like this change because very specifically when you compared old Mark of the Isles with something like, the Noxus Elixir, where you're getting +3/+0 until end of round, Mark was almost always better because it was in what was considered to be a better faction, and then also the drawback of granting the unit Ephemeral was either irrelevant because that unit was going to die anyway when you're making trades, or you're going for lethal, so irrelevant, or you're going to use something like Death Mark and then just remove the Ephemeral anyway. Or sometimes the granting of Ephemeral is to trigger something like your Cursed Keeper. So I've said it a number of times throughout this video, right? But a lot of these factions have these things that are appearing to be drawbacks that are actually enablers, and they fit a theme of your faction. And Mark of the Isles was a very powerful card that was also abusing the drawbacks. So I'm not at all surprised by this change. I actually think that by doing this, they make you consider now, like if you're playing an aggressive deck, you might want to consider Noxus a bit more now because of the power of Elixir, right? So we'll see. Last up is Rekindler, and this is simply just a cost increase from 6 to 7. That's it. I gotta be honest, I'm a little surprised by that. I think that with the exception of maybe mid-range decks that were also running Hecarim, and just kind of slapping the two of them in, I think most of the decks that were running Rekindler are still running Rekindler. Like, I know I'm still going to run it in my Anivia list and my Karma lists because I don't think that cost increase really hurts it that much. And in the case of like the mid-range Hecarim lists, going to 7 does kind of hurt that, but also Hecarim getting nerfed kind of hurt that as well. So you lost a lot of power level in both directions, and maybe that's their thinking, right? Maybe they're just saying, okay, because we also hit Hecarim, maybe if we only minorly touch this, that'll be enough. But I don't know. I'm still a fan of the card. I think it's still incredibly powerful. I had suspected that we might actually see something like Rekindler is a 4/4, and when it's played, it can revive the strongest dead ally champion. If it does, then grant Rekindler Ephemeral or something like that, where you don't get the permanent body on top of it. Basically, that idea of, you can play it if it's a truly dead card, you can play it to just get the 4/4 body if you really need it. Otherwise, you're getting like a 1-turn 4/4 body and rezzing a champion, because getting your strongest champion back is already a very powerful effect. So I kind of felt like that might be where they would go. Making Rekindler become Ephemeral also kind of fit the Shadow Isles theme, but no, they just went with a straight cost increase, and I think you'll still see a fair amount of Rekindler on the ladder. Specifically because there's a lot of Karma lists that just weren't touched. And another card that I really thought we were going to see adjusted is still on the watch list here, and that's Frenzied Skitterer. How has this card not been touched yet? This card is so good on offense, on defense. This card plus the new Callista, Fearsome is looking pretty fearsome coming in this next patch. So obviously, again, they're watching Elise and Skitterer here, so they recognize that Fearsome could make another pretty drastic comeback. Glimpse Beyond is also mentioned here, as is Shadow Assassin, which I thought was really interesting. It's the most played card in Legends of Runeterra. Now, they say for good reason, and I get it, right? Good elusive stats, free draw, it's an easy splash, it helps you, even if you're not running an elusive deck, just have an elusive blocker for a pretty low investment. So, you know, it's mentioned here, but I gotta be honest, just because it's the most played card doesn't necessarily mean that's a bad thing. I think that a card like this existing and being enticing is actually good for a mechanic like elusives. Elusives is interesting. A lot of people talk about how it's a problematic mechanic and it promotes non-interaction, which is partially true, but there's two things to consider. One, you need some level of penetration in games, right? You need a way for people to find a way to win that doesn't involve either your opponent having a bad draw, breaking their hand, or you just having like the perfect counter or blowing them out, right? There needs to be ways for you to capitalize on moments in time and weaknesses in your opponent's game plan. And elusive and fearsome and these effects where you can get damage in that your opponent can't necessarily stop are overall good as long as they don't just like dominate the entire strategy of the game. So I like to think of them as like throwing jabs in a boxing match, right? It's just chip damage. But effects like elusive, specifically elusive, where you have to have it or you don't, they are more of an issue when there are less cards with the keyword, as weird as that sounds, right? The less elusive there is in the game, the more powerful elusive becomes, because if I play mine, you know, I draw it and I play it first, there's less likelihood that you're going to have one. If you do have one, you have to have drawn it, and until you draw it, you either have to answer the one I've played, or it just keeps getting free damage. So there needs to be a reasonable amount of elusive available to folks, or ways to block it. This game doesn't have the equivalent of like reach that Magic the Gathering does. Elusive in Magic would be like flying, and then reach would be creatures that can block as though they had flying. We don't have allies or followers in this game that can block units that have elusive, even if they don't, at least not yet. That might be something they add, but for the most part, incentivizing players to include, even if it's just a one of or a two of elusive units naturally, means that they're just going to kind of accidentally have ways to deal with your opponent being non-interactive, if that makes sense. So I think kind of just general, you know, general purpose, maybe even ubiquitous inclusions like this, even if they're small scale, right? Just like onesie twosies, could be good until we get more cards, right? As our collection becomes more robust, as more sets get added, and there are more ways for you to have that back and forth, then perhaps this card could be looked at that point. But I think for now, just having an attractive card where you want to include it even if you're not running elusive as like a core strategy is actually a good thing for the game, as weird as that sounds. And that's it for the card changes. The rest is about game pacing and feel. So a lot of this is about you know, cards and interactions, speed of animations, things like that, turn timers, things like that. So the big ones to note here: casting a burst spell now puts some time back on your timer, and you'll now get some extra time on your turn after your opponent casts spells on theirs to guard against a bunch of your opponent's end of turn burst spells eating away at your turn. So like the idea is you wait till close to the end of a turn, and then somebody plays you know, just a bunch of burst spells in a row, and then as the animations are going, you are watching the animations while the timer ticks away, sort of thing. So minor improvements, but they're looking at it. And then there are some expedition archetype changes. A lot of these have to deal or have to do with or dealing with the changes that were made up above. I swear I haven't been drinking, just coffee. But the idea is pretty simple, right? The Mage Seekers kind of created a different version of an old archetype, and there are some things that needed to be moved around as a result. And then a lot of these other ones are just kind of like balance changes, but overall I'm a bit of a fan. And then bug fixes, so that's it. I want to know what you think. Do you think this was enough? Not enough? Do you think Shadow Isles will still reign Supreme, I'm really concerned about Karma, and I'm really concerned about Frenzied Skitterer. I think those are the two cards that have the potential to really impact the meta going forward. Games have already been kind of slowing down a bit as it is. Now, there are some pretty cool new aggro tools. I'm dying to try out the new Callista. I'm really excited about that card, but Skitterer not getting touched and most of the Karma control decks essentially not getting touched is, I don't know, worrisome is what I guess I'll say. So anyway, I want to know what you think. What are you excited to try out? Do you think they went far enough, etc., etc.? I love reading reactions to things like this because the reality is, like, none of us knows 100%, you know, for certain. But that's it. If you made it this far, I appreciate you watching, and I still don't have a new outro, so I guess I'll see you later. I don't know.